Hey, what's up folks? Today I want to show you what the absolute limit of attacks looks like. And for some of you, this is affecting your damage and you might not realize it because it renders fine. And I don't mean you just stop getting extra damage. I mean you are actively doing less damage than a build with lower attack speed, and I can prove it to you. The server limits are not that hard to hit, particularly for crossbows and quarterstaves. I'm going to go over my testing methodology, some examples, I'll show you some bugs that can scuff your damage even worse than missing a breakpoint, and then I'm also going to update the PoE2 wiki because we're sort of all in this discovery phase together. There are chapters in the description if you want to jump around. So my goal is to explain why this character on the right is actually doing a lot less damage than the character on the left, even though everything about them is identical, and in fact the sheet DPS is much higher for the character on the right. I'm going to do the same for crossbows, which in certain breakpoints, this has an even bigger effect. And finally, the same experiment for bow builds. A little over a week ago, I made a video where I went accuracy stacking to see how many grenades I could sustain, and that led me down another path, which was, what are the limits in Path of Exile 2? So in Path of Exile 1, we know it's been extensively tested. The server frame length is 33 milliseconds.
Normally a player can only do one skill per frame. That's like an actual rule. The server runs at 30 frames a second and you can only do 30 skills a second.
In order for the numbers to make sense in this video, I need to lay some quick groundwork. Let's start with a frame. In PoE, there are numerous concurrent systems all resolving at different times. This can be extremely chaotic with hundreds of projectiles, triggers, hit tests, monster AI, spells, etc. To reduce some of the compute complexity, the server will bucket and resolve groups of events in chunks of time called a frame, similar to the job the compositor does on your computer to actually render the game. But the information in a server frame is all context, not graphics, and it's the atomic unit of time in Path of Exile. If something was scheduled to happen in the middle of a frame, let's say at 50 milliseconds, it would get batched with the other things that also need resolving in the same frame and actually resolve at 66 milliseconds as part of the second frame. Now enter Path of Exile 2 and we have a new game engine and new skills, and some of them are insane. Like Rapid Shot, which has a 550% of base attack speed multiplier, making extremely high attacks per second very real, or Shock Burst rounds, which has 450%. In fact, with about 5 to 10 divines worth of gear, you can hit these limits, and probably many of you are. So the two questions I set out to answer concretely are, what are the new limits for attacks, and what happens when you go over it? To answer these, I designed tests for each of the weapon types I thought I could reasonably push, and here's where I ended up. For quarterstaves, I used Pillar and Ice Strike and pushed the attacks all the way up to 42 per second for normal strikes. For crossbows, I used both Shock Burst and Rapid Shot, and I tested it in intervals up to an eye-watering 125 attacks per second unbuffed in my hideout. And for bows, I used a Quill Rain and Tornado Shot, which has the highest effective attack speed for bow skills at 120%. Now measuring the attacks for non-crossbows is a bit more challenging, so I removed all sources of life regen, and I linked the lowest possible level of skill to Life Tap, which allowed me to measure my attacks over time. I'd measure the duration between the first frame of the attack's animation to the first frame where the insufficient life icon popped above my head. Now in this test I have 2435 life, a casting cost of 8 life, and I'm expecting 203 normal strikes and 101 third strikes, which take about twice as long as the normals, for a total time of 13.359 seconds. Now every value below 30.3 works perfectly fine. I tested several of those, but look at what happens above it. In every interval I tested above 30.3, there was a damage loss, and it wasn't a nominal amount. And to be clear, I'm talking about a damage loss versus if you had hit 30.3 precisely. The expected damage loss numbers are quite a bit higher if the server side limitations weren't in place. If we perform a similar test, but this time with crossbows, a slightly different but more dramatic finding holds true. If you hold perfectly still with no mouse or character movement, you are able to attack at 30.3 without server frame loss, but almost no one does this. Any mouse movement that rotates your character more than about 45 degrees, or any type of actual character movement, and you lose huge amounts of damage. Even just over the action cap, it still takes us about 19% longer to empty a full clip. Most players hitting this threshold will be in the low 30s somewhere, and losing large chunks of damage and probably not realizing it, is my guess. Now, you could reduce your attack speed by socketing Scattershot. However, Scattershot is probably the worst support for high clip ammunition crossbow skills because of the way it works. That is, Scattershot sequentially adds bolts to your crossbow without spending a bolt. It doesn't fire 3 at the same time, and that means you're spending more for a single cast to generate them, reducing your effective attack speed further, as they don't shotgun. The game client will render multiple projectiles triggered in the same frame together, so sometimes you'll see 2 of them exit the crossbow, but this is also true for the single projectile case. If you see a POB with shock bursts multiplied by 3, you should remove it. It's not how the support works. And more than that, it's easy to empirically test, and I recommend you try this if you are currently using it. First, we're going to get a baseline and use a 6-link without Scattershot. I'm going to trade Primal Armament for Scattershot here in just a second. Same thing, we dropped Primal Armament, picked up Scattershot. And then this time, I'm going to do it again, but with 4 supports. I'm just going to entirely remove Scattershot. For completeness, I performed the same experiments with bows and came to the same results as I did with quarterstaves, though to be honest, I'm not sure any actual builds will be hitting the limits with bows, as it required a very specific quill rain and tornado shot setup. More than anything, it served to validate my findings, and I expect many people are running into it with quarterstaves, and likely a huge number are with crossbows. Now to recap, if you're using attacks at more than 30.3 attacks per second, outside of channeling, you're almost certainly scuffing your damage output, and by a lot. Reducing your attacks and investing those resources instead into hit damage or quality of life stats should have an excellent return for your build. Alright, that's all I got for this video. This was originally a section in the Witch Hunter Zero to Hero project I'm working on, but it felt important enough to warrant a separate video. Like and subscribe to something that was useful or informative, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Take care.